I'm Lauren Avery, 24, and the church felt colder than the marble under my heels, the kind of cold that sits in your bones and won't let go. The pews held relatives who wouldn't meet my eyes, people who came to witness a reading, not a farewell. No one cried, no one reached for my hand, and the choir's last note died without a single echo. When the minister asked if anyone wished to speak, the silence that followed told me everything about how they measured my grandfather's life. I stood because I could not let that be the final word. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to hold your head high when a room hoped you would sit down. My name is Lauren, and I grew up in a house where kindness was not a word on a wall, but a way we moved through the day. My dad, Mark, was the sort of man who made strangers feel like they'd known him for years, a steady laugh and a pair of broad shoulders that turned our small kitchen into the safest place on earth. My mom, Elaine, painted in the afternoons when the light slipped through the blinds just right, soft watercolor scenes of the Georgia coast she'd loved as a girl. She'd stack the finished pages on the counter like quiet prayers. We didn't have much beyond the mortgage and a second-hand SUV, but the little we had was handled with care coupons, clipped a jar of loose change by the sink, a Saturday routine that never failed, Library Park grilled cheese. My parents taught me to say thank you the first time to return what I borrowed to leave a place cleaner than I found it. My mother's voice was gentle when she corrected me, my father's more like a nudge than a push. If we had a rule that mattered most, it was this: tell the truth, even when it costs you. I wore it like a bracelet. I never took off through school projects done late, but honest, through teenage friendships where I learned how easily a lie unravels everything you've built. That mix of warmth and straight lines shaped the way I looked at the world. It meant that when people were unkind, I didn't rush to answer them with the same. It also meant that when a boundary needed drawing, I steadied my hand before I drew it. The farm where I would later live felt a world away from all that. Back then, it existed for me only as a rumor land outside town, a long drive a man who didn't come to birthdays. My grandfather, Raymond Hale, sent a card some years with his name written in a careful block script that said nothing about who he was. He and my mother were not estranged exactly, just built from different timber. She called him set in his ways and left it there the way you place a heavy book back on the shelf because you aren't ready to lift it down. When she cooked Sunday dinner, she set one extra plate without comment, as if practicing hospitality for an arrival that never seemed to find our street. If our home was light and color, the world around it was modest and practical. We lived on a street where folks mowed their own lawns and borrowed each other's ladders, where the sound of a screen door was the soundtrack of summer. My friends' parents stretched paychecks the way mine did, and the big houses we passed on errands were for looking at through the windshield, not for imagining ourselves inside. Still, my parents gave me the sense that enough was a blessing, not a deficiency. We worked with what we had: a hand-me-down camera I used to photograph the backyard maple, a desk my dad sanded smooth for school, a little dog named Buddy, who stole socks, and our patience in equal measure. Even with that steady ground, there was a space in me shaped like questions I didn't know how to ask. My mother's art hinted at stories she kept folded away. My father's eyes softened whenever she talked about her childhood, and then the moment would pass like steam on a mirror. We didn't speak much about the farm or the man at the center of it. I learned to accept that some doors in a family stay closed until someone finds the right key. When a postcard came with a photograph of winter fields under a pale sky, my mother tucked it in a drawer and patted my hand as if to say, "Not yet." The first break in that quiet came at a kitchen table on a weekday night that began like any other. I'd finished a geometry assignment, and my mom had washed her brushes. My dad was reading the paper with the careful concentration he gave everything. There was a knock, 2 firm raps, and the drumbeat in my chest didn't match the ordinary sounds of our house anymore. I remember the way my father folded the paper exactly along the crease before he rose. Small habits still carried out in the half-second before the world tipped. On the other side of the door stood 2 people who didn't belong to our routine, their faces the color of the cloudy day behind them, their voices measured in a way that signaled caution, long before I understood why. Standing now amid polished pews and lowered eyes, the air of the church pressed in as the minister's question faded. Does anyone wish to speak? My relatives stared at their laps, the hymnals, the exit sign anywhere but the front of the room. I felt the familiar pull to stay small and the stronger pull not to. I rose, the wood creaking under my heel. And before I shaped the first word for the man in the casket, that knock at our door, those two raps that would divide my life, flashed through my mind like lightning on a clear day. The knock on the door that evening didn't sound urgent at first, just firm and unfamiliar. My dad set his paper down, folding it carefully along the seam, before rising. Mom's brush paused mid-stroke, a trail of pale blue drying on the bristles. When the door opened, two uniformed officers stood framed in the porch light, their hats, low eyes, full of the kind of apology that always arrives too late. I remember the stillness that followed the way the refrigerator hummed like a nervous witness. Words reached me in fragments, whether flight search efforts, but they didn't form sense until my father's name was spoken. Mark Avery, and then my mother's. The air left the room all at once, like it had been holding its breath too. The days that followed blurred into quiet faces and casseroles. Every adult I knew seemed to speak in whispers or not at all. I kept waiting for my mother's shoes to appear by the door, for the smell of her paint to drift down the hall. My father's watch sat on the kitchen table, its second hand ticking like it didn't know it was supposed to stop. I didn't cry. I didn't move much either. I just listened to the sound of other people's grief happening around me, like I'd wandered into the wrong house and couldn't find my way back out. When the social worker came, she spoke gently, her words rehearsed. I was 12, and she told me we'd try to find a suitable guardian. It sounded clinical, like she was rehoming a pet. A few days later, my Aunt Denise arrived in a pressed navy dress and a scent that reminded me of old pennies. She hugged me stiffly, one arm, more out of obligation than comfort. "I'll take her," she said to the woman with the clipboard. Family should stay with family. There was no warmth in it, only convenience. We drove for hours through back roads that narrowed until there was no center line left to follow. The town signs came less often, and when they did, the paint was cracked from years of sun. We passed fields where scarecrows leaned like tired men. By the time we turned onto a gravel road lined with bare trees, my suitcase had tipped over twice in the back seat, and the silence between us had hardened into something unbreakable. The farmhouse appeared at the end of a long dirt drive, a square of weathered wood and tin crouched against the wind. Its windows were dim even in daylight, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle, like it had given up asking for repairs. On the porch stood a man I recognized only from the one photograph my mother kept tucked behind a painting her father Raymond Hale. In that picture, he had been younger, with broad shoulders and a faint smile. The man before me was older, thinner, his hair gone silver gray, his posture straight as a fence post. His eyes, a pale steel color, met mine and didn't blink. "You're late," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. "Don't waste my time, Lauren." I didn't know whether to nod or speak, so I just stood there, one hand clutching the handle of my small suitcase. Aunt Denise cleared her throat, muttered something about needing to head back before dark, and drove off without looking at me. The sound of her car faded down the road until all that remained was the low moan of the wind against the barn. Inside the house smelled faintly of earth and smoke. The furniture was simple and worn. A clock ticked somewhere, and each second sounded like a hammer. My room was small, barely large enough for a twin bed, a wooden desk, and a window that looked out over an empty field. There were no curtains, no rug, not even a lamp. On the wall above the desk hung a small chalkboard with two words written in white, "Work hard." That night, I lay on the stiff mattress staring at the ceiling, trying to remember my parents' voices. The only sound came from the floorboards creaking as Raymond moved through the house, each step slow but deliberate. When the clock downstairs struck 5 the next morning, his voice filled the hallway. "Up," he called. "The sun doesn't wait." The days became a pattern so tight it left no room for thought. I rose before dawn, pulled on the jeans he left folded by the door, and followed him outside. The air smelled of hay and iron. I fed pigs, gathered eggs, and shoveled more mud than I thought could exist in one place. By breakfast, my hands were raw from the cold water pump. We ate in silence, oatmeal toast, black coffee. He sat at one end of the table. I sat at the other. Between us lay a distance that wasn't measured in feet, but in years of something unspoken. Once, while washing dishes, I let the plate slip and shatter against the sink. The noise startled me more than the accident itself. Raymond didn't raise his voice, but his eyes were sharp enough to do the job. "Careless hands waste time," he said quietly, "and time is the one thing you can't earn back." Then he turned and walked out, leaving me to pick up the shards and the lesson both. There was no television, no radio, only work and the ticking clock that seemed to watch over it. When I grew tired and slowed down, he reminded me of what the day demanded. When I cried once quietly after cutting my finger on a fence wire, he didn't scold or comfort, only handed me a clean rag. "You'll heal faster if you keep moving," he said, as if rest itself were indulgence. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the wind slide across the roof. I'd whisper my parents' names, afraid to say them too loud, as if the house might take offense. In those dark hours, it felt like I'd been erased and redrawn in pencil, faint, uncertain, easy to smudge away. But there were moments, small ones, when I saw something almost human flicker behind his sternness. Once, after a long day mending a broken fence, he handed me a glass of water and nodded at the field. "You did that right," he said. Just that and nothing more. But the words stayed with me longer than any praise I'd ever earned. As the weeks passed, my body toughened. My skin freckled from sun, my arms grew stronger. Still, the loneliness stretched like the fields themselves, endless quiet waiting for something to break the horizon. One evening, while scrubbing the porch steps, I dared to ask, "Did you know my mom used to paint?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze fixed on the far trees, the light fading behind them. "She did," he said, finally. "Paint doesn't fix fences." Then he turned and went inside. I held on to that one sentence longer than I should have. It told me that somewhere beneath the discipline and the distance he carried her memory too, just in a different shape. But understanding that didn't make the work easier. The days bled into months. My school assignments came in brown envelopes once a week mailed from the district office. I studied at night by lantern light, my handwriting shaking with exhaustion. By winter, I'd stopped counting how long I'd been there. The routine had swallowed time whole. The only markers were the weather and the ache in my hands. I learned not to expect comfort, not to ask questions, not to hope for softness in a house built on stone habits. Yet somewhere deep down, something quiet began to form an instinct, maybe, to endure, to last, to become the kind of person who could look at the day and not flinch. Looking back, I can still remember the first morning I woke before the alarm. The clock read 4:58, and I was already sitting up, boots in hand. The habit was his, but the choice had become mine. I didn't know it yet, but that small act rising on my own before his voice called would be the start of something that would one day save me. The first winter on the farm was the kind that wrapped everything in silence. The fields turned brittle and gray, the air so sharp it burned when I breathed. Each morning began before dawn, my breath rising in white clouds as I broke the layer of ice that formed on the water troughs overnight. The barn creaked under the weight of the wind, and the old tin roof rattled like it was ready to lift away. Inside, Raymond moved with the same rhythm he always did, precise, unhurried, and wordless. I followed his lead step for step, pretending that if I mirrored his pace long enough, I might understand the purpose behind it. The days blurred together one long loop of chores, meals, and exhaustion. I learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders or the pause of his boots at the doorway. When the air around him grew heavy, I stayed quiet and worked faster. When he seemed calm, I tried to ask small questions: how old the barn was, what kind of tree shaded the porch, but most were met with a grunt or silence. My words drifted away like dust in the rafters, unanswered but not forgotten. There were times I almost forgot what laughter sounded like. At night, the only voice I heard was my own whisper, soft and low, reciting my parents' names, as if they might hear. I kept a photo of them tucked in the corner of the mirror, worn at the edges from my thumb, tracing their faces. The ache of losing them never softened. It just learned to hide beneath the weight of the next day's work. I told myself that staying busy meant I was surviving, but some nights when the wind howled across the fields, it felt more like I was being erased a little at a time. Once, after weeks of endless snow, I made the mistake of speaking up. My palms were blistered from hauling buckets, the skin raw and stinging. "My hands hurt," I said quietly as we sat down to breakfast. He didn't look up from his oatmeal. "Hurt," he said the word hard and clipped. "You'll live." Then, as if the matter were settled, he stood and poured himself more coffee. The chair legs scraped against the floor, the sound sharp enough to sting my eyes. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. He never noticed. Or maybe he did, and that was his way of teaching me something I didn't yet understand. The chores didn't end when the sun went down. If the lantern burned out before the hay was stacked, I worked in the dark. When I spilled a pail of milk one morning, he didn't raise his voice. He just stared at the puddle spreading across the floor. "That milk is sweat," he said. "Yours and mine. Don't waste what you work for." I cleaned it up, each swipe of the rag heavy with shame I didn't know how to name. The smell of sour milk clung to my hands for days, a quiet reminder that mistakes had weight. Still somewhere beneath the fatigue and fear, a small thread of pride began to form. The first time I lifted a hay bale without struggling, I caught him watching from the doorway. He didn't smile, but he gave a single nod before turning away. It wasn't approval in the way most people would recognize, but it was something, and I held on to it like a spark in a dark room. School came through the mail in thick brown envelopes. I'd spread the worksheets across the kitchen table after dinner, using the same pencil until it was too short to hold. If I fell asleep over my math problems, Raymond would tap the table in the morning and say, "Finish what you start." It wasn't kindness, but it kept me going. In those quiet hours, with only the hum of the old refrigerator and the smell of wood smoke in the air, I learned the rhythm of perseverance. By early spring, the snow began to melt and muddy paths replaced the frozen ground. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden: broken fences, a leaky roof, tools left to rust. There was always more work, and Raymond seemed to grow stronger with it. He fixed what was broken without complaint, his movements steady even when the wind bit at his face. Watching him, I began to understand that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was focus. It was survival. One evening, as we worked to patch the barn door, I asked, "Why don't you ever take a day off?" He paused, hammer in hand, and looked out toward the fading light. "If you stop moving, life catches up to you," he said simply. Then he went back to work. That night, I lay awake thinking about those words. Maybe that was what he'd been doing all these years, outrunning whatever waited for him in the quiet. The loneliness changed shape as time passed. It became less of a sharp pain and more of a dull ache that I carried everywhere. I learned not to expect comfort, not to wish for it, but I also learned to find small moments of peace. The sound of rain on the tin roof, the glow of morning light through the barn slats, the rhythm of chores done right, those became my refuge. I started humming while I worked soft melodies my mother used to sing when she painted. At first I did it quietly, afraid he'd scold me for the noise. But one afternoon, I caught him pausing in the doorway as I sang his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. Still, something in that silence felt different, less like disapproval and more like memory. By the time I turned 15, I could run the farm alone if I had to. I knew which fences needed patching first after a storm, which animals would give trouble at feeding time. Raymond trusted me with the bookkeeping, letting me add entries to his worn leather ledger under his watchful eye. Every penny tells a story, he'd say, tapping the page. "Listen to it." His handwriting was neat and exact, the letters pressed so hard they nearly cut through the paper. I tried to match it, wanting my lines to look like his. Even with all the progress, some nights the emptiness returned sharper than ever. It came without warning at the dinner table in the barn, even when I was doing everything right. It was the silence that followed after I said, "Good night, Grandpa," and no answer came. It was the space between us that no amount of hard work could fill. One evening after a long day, I left the dishes on the counter, too tired to care. I fell asleep before finishing them, and the sound that woke me was his heavy step outside my room. The door creaked open, and in his hand was the old leather strap he used to hang on the wall. He didn't use it, but he swung it once through the air, the sound slicing the dark. "Clean it now," he said, his tone low and even. I stumbled from bed, washed each dish under the freezing faucet until my fingers went numb. He stood there until the last plate was dry, then walked away without another word. That night I cried quietly, facing the wall so he wouldn't hear. I told myself it was the cold making me shiver, not the fear or the shame. But when morning came, I was up before his voice reached the hallway, determined not to give him another reason to remind me how the world worked. The months that followed taught me to separate pain from purpose. I no longer flinched at his sharp words or waited for praise that would never come. Instead, I counted victories in small ways: the fence that didn't break after a storm, the crops that grew straight and tall, the rare mornings when he'd leave an extra biscuit on my plate. By the time summer returned, I'd grown taller, stronger, quieter. The farm had carved its lessons deep into me, shaping a resilience I hadn't asked for, but couldn't live without. And though I didn't know it yet, that same strength, the one he'd beaten into rhythm and habit, would soon become the reason I could finally stand up to him. The day would come when the silence between us would no longer protect him, and the words I'd swallowed for years would finally find their way out. By the time I turned 16, the farm no longer felt like a stranger's place. The air carried the same sharp scent of hay and dust, the same low hum of the wind against the barn. But something inside me had shifted. The fear that once kept me quiet had settled into a kind of steady patience. Raymond still spoke few words, but I had learned to read the language of his silence, the pause before a command, the faint lift of an eyebrow that meant I'd done something right. I worked hard enough that even he stopped checking my chores. I woke before the clock, ate quickly, and moved through each task with purpose. Somewhere along the way, the rules that used to weigh on me began to feel like a rhythm I could live by. The routines were demanding, but they gave me structure when grief still had no shape. Each morning started at 5 sharp, the rooster crowing before the sky turned gray. I'd pull on my boots, grab the pail, and head toward the stables where the horses stirred in the dim light. The sound of hooves against the floorboards and the slow, steady breathing of animals half asleep became a comfort I didn't expect. I'd learned every creak in the barn, every hinge that groaned before the door closed. Even the cold water from the pump had stopped feeling cruel. It just was another part of the day, like the frost on the windows or the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Raymond's discipline was absolute. He kept a pocket watch that clicked every minute with precision, and his movements followed it as if his heartbeat ran on time. If the sun rose at 6, he was already outside by 5:30. He never cut corners, never called something good enough. At first, that rigidity used to drain me, but over time, I started seeing how it worked like a compass. The order, the repetition, the attention to detail, they were his armor. And without meaning to, I began to wear it too. I stopped waiting for comfort or praise, and instead found a strange calm in finishing what I started. Still, there were moments when the old ache surfaced sharp as ever. I'd see a streak of paint left on a fence post and remember my mother's brushstrokes, the gentle way she'd guide my hand when I was small. I once mentioned her paintings as we worked side by side fixing a gate. "She was talented," I said softly, brushing the dirt from my palms. Raymond's hammer paused mid-swing. For a second I thought he might respond, but he just nodded once and went back to work. The air between us grew still, heavy with something unsaid. That silence taught me more than any lecture. Some memories were too tender for him to touch. Winter came again with the same harshness as before. One afternoon, snow started falling earlier than expected, thick flakes blurring the edge of the fields. The roof above the stable had been leaking for weeks, and I thought surely we'd leave it until morning. Instead, Raymond put on his coat, grabbed a ladder, and nodded for me to follow. The cold bit through my gloves as I held the lantern while he worked. "It's freezing," I said through chattering teeth. He looked down from the roof, his breath a cloud of frost. "If you start something, you finish it," he said. "Weather doesn't care." We stayed out there until every nail was set, our faces numb, the snow clinging to our sleeves. When we finally went inside, I noticed his hands shaking as he poured coffee, but his voice was steady as ever. That night, as I warmed my hands by the fire, I realized I'd watched something deeper than stubbornness. It was endurance, the kind that kept you alive when love and luck didn't. His lessons weren't spoken as much as they were shown. He fixed things that were broken no matter how small. A frayed rope, a cracked window, a hinge that squeaked, he saw to all of it. He never wasted anything. Scraps of wood were stacked neatly for fire kindling. Nails were saved in jars sorted by size. If a loaf of bread hardened overnight, it was sliced and toasted the next morning. Once I spilled a pitcher of milk across the kitchen floor, and he didn't scold me right away. He just stared at it, then said quietly, "That milk is sweat, Lauren. Don't waste what costs effort." I cleaned it up, cheeks burning, but later I understood it wasn't about the milk at all. It was about respect for work, even when no one was watching. The one thing he valued above all else was honesty. He'd ask simple questions sometimes. Did you finish the west fence? Or did you leave the gate unlatched? And if I hesitated even for a breath, his eyes would narrow. Lying is lying to yourself first, he'd say. Don't make it a habit. He didn't need to raise his voice for the words to stay with me. They echoed each time I faced a choice, not just on the farm, but later in every part of life. When I turned 18, Raymond didn't mention it. No cake, no card, no acknowledgement at breakfast, just another dawn, another day of work. But that evening after dinner, he placed an envelope on the table beside my plate. It was plain my name written in the same firm handwriting that filled his ledger. Inside was a small folded note and a check. The note read, "For your future. Use it wisely." I looked up surprised, but he was already rinsing his mug at the sink. I wanted to thank him to ask what he meant by future, but the words didn't come. A week later, my final high school report card arrived. Straight A's every class. I set it on the table beside the envelope he'd given me. I applied to college. I said, my voice unsteady. An art program. I got in. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he reached into the drawer, pulled out another stack of papers and slid them toward me. "You'll go to business school," he said. "Art doesn't pay the bills." His tone wasn't cruel. It was final. I stared at the forms, the neat print, the boxes he'd already filled out for me. All that work, all that obedience, and suddenly I saw the wall between us for what it was. He hadn't built it to protect me. He'd built it to keep me inside. I tried to explain, to tell him how much I wanted it, how painting was the one place I still felt connected to my mother, but his expression never changed. "You're old enough to know better," he said. "You'll thank me someday." The words stung in a way his silence never had. I folded the papers, set them back on the table, and went to my room. The wind outside beat against the window, and I knew the decision he'd made for me wasn't just about school, it was about control. That night I lay awake for hours, the check still in my hand. Every lesson he'd taught me, discipline, thrift, perseverance, honesty, they all felt like pieces of something meant to make me strong. But for the first time, I wondered if strength was supposed to mean obedience. I closed my eyes and pictured the easel my mother used to paint on the colors she mixed, until they looked like sunlight itself. The choice I faced wasn't just about what to study. It was about who I would become. The next morning, Raymond's alarm rang as usual. I heard him moving through the kitchen, the clatter of the kettle, the scrape of a chair. I dressed, walked to the table, and sat across from him. The air was heavy with unspoken things, thicker than the steam from our mugs. He didn't look up, and I didn't speak. Somewhere between the ticking clock and the creak of the floorboards, I realized something had changed, not outside, but in me. The silence that once kept me small no longer fit. It would take only one more conversation to bring that truth to the surface, one moment when everything we'd built, every lesson, every rule would finally crack open. And when it did, neither of us would be the same again. The morning after my 18th birthday, the kitchen was filled with a stillness that didn't belong to any season. The coffee steamed on the table untouched, and the smell of toast lingered, though neither of us had eaten. Raymond sat across from me, the stack of business school papers still spread between us like a line drawn in chalk. The sunlight angled through the window, landing on the corner of my art portfolio. I'd placed it there on purpose, hoping the colors inside might soften him. They didn't. His eyes flicked toward it, then back to his coffee. "I'm not going," I said quietly. My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to. "I've decided. I'm going to art school." For a second, nothing moved. No sound, no breath, just the clock ticking above the stove. Then he looked up, the lines around his eyes tightening. "You'll go to business school," he replied, calm, but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You'll learn something useful, something that keeps you alive." I took a slow breath, the weight in my chest heavier than any bale of hay I'd carried. "It's my life, Grandpa," I said, trying to meet his eyes. "I want to build something of my own." "Painting makes me feel foolish," he interrupted, his voice rising. "That's what it makes you. Foolish and short-sighted. You think a handful of pretty pictures will feed you? You think this world cares about what you feel." He pushed the papers toward me, his hand firm. "You'll do what's right, what's responsible." The years of swallowed words caught in my throat. For so long I'd done what he asked, learned the lessons he thought mattered, but this time I couldn't. "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "I've worked for everything you've asked. I've done it all. But this is mine. I want to paint. I'm not you." The chair legs scraped against the floor as he stood. His height had always made him seem unshakable, like one of those oak trees that had weathered every storm. "You're ungrateful," he said, each word deliberate. "I took you in when no one else would. I gave you a roof, a future, a name. And this is what I get." I stood too, the air between us burning. "You didn't save me," I said before I could stop myself. "You just made me work so hard, I forgot what it felt like to be alive." My heart pounded in my ears. "You never asked what I wanted, not once. You think everything is strength and discipline, but you don't even know me." He stared at me, his jaw tight, the pulse in his temple visible. "You want freedom," he said finally, his tone turning cold. "Then take it. But don't you dare come back here when it fails you." The words hit harder than any scolding he'd ever given. For a second I thought he might soften, that he'd take it back the way people do when they realize what they've just broken. But his expression didn't change. I waited, hoping for even one word that sounded like love. It never came. I went to my room, hands trembling as I pulled my small suitcase from under the bed. The air smelled faintly of the oil lamp, of the same dust that had filled every corner of my childhood. I packed quietly: jeans, a few shirts, the photo of my parents, and my sketchbook. When I closed the door behind me, the house felt larger than it ever had, hollow and echoing with things left unsaid. The night air outside was cool against my face. The moon hung low, pale over the empty field, and gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward the road. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. Behind me, the farmhouse stood in silence, one light burning in the kitchen window. I told myself not to look back, but I did anyway. He was there, standing at the window, a shadow framed in yellow light. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned away. I walked until the road curved and the house disappeared. My shoulders ached under the weight of the suitcase, and the night grew colder. I stopped beneath a lone oak tree at the edge of the property and sank down against the trunk. The stars blurred above me, and the anger that had carried me this far began to fade, leaving only a hollow ache. I'd wanted him to listen, to see me as more than the rules he'd built his life around. But he'd made his choice, and now I'd made mine. I pulled my knees to my chest and rested my chin on them. The silence out here was different, softer, full of distant sounds I'd never noticed before. A coyote's call, the whisper of dry grass, the steady rhythm of my own breath. I thought of my parents then, of the laughter that used to fill our house, of the way my mother would hum as she painted. The tears came quietly, not from weakness, but from release. By the time the horizon began to lighten, I was numb from the cold. My grandfather's words kept circling in my head. "You want freedom, go." But mixed with them were his lessons, the ones I hadn't asked for, but had absorbed all the same. If you start something, you finish it. Don't waste what you've worked for. Be honest, even when it hurts. Those phrases had been burned into me over the years, and now they followed me into this empty stretch of road. I realized then that even as I ran from him, I was still carrying his voice. When the first light touched the fields, the anger was gone. All that remained was exhaustion and regret. I imagined walking back up the drive, telling him I was sorry that I'd go to business school, that he was right. I pictured him sitting at the table with his coffee, the clock ticking above his shoulder, everything exactly as it had always been. I didn't want to fail him. I never had. I just wanted him to see me. The decision to turn back came quietly. I stood brushing the dirt from my jeans and began walking toward home. Each step felt heavier than the last, the kind that belongs to someone who already knows they'll have to apologize. When the house came into view, the early light glinted off the tin roof, and for a moment it almost looked welcoming. The front door was ajar. Inside, the house was still. Too still. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside my suitcase still in hand. "Grandpa," I called, my voice echoing down the hall. No answer. I followed the faint smell of coffee into the kitchen, and that's where I found him lying on the floor beside his chair, one hand resting on the open ledger he'd kept all his life. "Grandpa," I whispered, kneeling beside him. The world around me blurred. His eyes were closed, his face calm, almost peaceful. I shook his shoulder, called his name again, but he didn't move. The cup beside him had gone cold. The doctor would later call it a stroke, sudden and final. But in that moment, all I could hear was the ticking that had stopped. All I could see was the ledger lying open, a pen still resting on the page. The funeral came 3 days later. Family I hadn't seen in years filled the small church. Their voices hushed, their eyes restless. Aunt Denise arrived wearing too much perfume and not enough sincerity. I heard whispers of miser and old fool drifting between pews. They didn't see the man who had raised me. They saw the fortune they thought he'd hidden. When the minister asked if anyone wanted to say something, the room went silent. No one stood. The stillness pressed against me, thick and suffocating. My hands shook as I rose, the wood creaking under my step. I walked to the front, my knees weak but steady enough to stand where no one else would. "I'm Lauren," I said softly, my voice trembling but clear. "Raymond Hale's granddaughter." Every eye turned toward me, some surprised, some bored, some expectant. I took a breath, my hands gripping the edge of the pulpit. "He wasn't easy to love," I said, "and he didn't make it easy to understand him. But he taught me how to work, how to endure, and how to stand when life tries to break you." The words came slowly, but they came. I used to think he was only strict. Now I know he was strong, and he wanted me to be strong too. When I stepped down, the church was quiet again, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't judgment, it was respect, even if they didn't know why. I sat back in my seat, my heart still racing. I didn't see him standing at the window anymore, didn't hear his voice calling from the hallway, but somehow I knew that if he could see me, then he'd recognize the strength he'd tried so hard to build. I just didn't yet know that this would only be the beginning of what he left behind. When the funeral ended, people shuffled out of the pews in pairs, their hushed voices echoing off the wooden beams. I stayed seated until the last one left, watching the sunlight fade through the stained glass. The church felt smaller now, emptied of both sound and purpose. I wanted to breathe, but the air carried too much history. The scent of old hymn books, the creak of the floor under my shoes, it all reminded me that endings rarely came clean. I looked toward the front where his casket sat, the wood, dark and simple, just as he would have wanted it. I whispered goodbye again, quieter this time. As I turned to leave, a man in a gray suit approached from the aisle. He looked out of place among my family's worn coats and impatient glances. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Lauren Avery?" he asked. I nodded, surprised. "I'm Michael Granger," he said, extending his hand. "Your grandfather's attorney. Could we speak privately?" We sat in the front pew, the light catching on his polished briefcase. "Your grandfather left clear instructions," he said, opening a folder. The paper rustled softly. "He wanted me to be here today after the service." I braced myself for talk of debts or farmland, but instead he said the words that froze everything around me. "You're his sole heir." For a moment I thought I'd misheard. The world tilted, the stained glass colors swimming across the floor. What I managed to say. He nodded, his expression kind but measured. "Everything, his assets, property, holdings, they all pass to you." From behind us came a sharp intake of breath. Aunt Denise had lingered near the doorway. Her heels clicked toward us like warning shots. "That can't be right," she snapped, her voice slicing through the quiet. "He had nothing left. That house, that land, it's barely worth a dime. Michael glanced up unbothered. Carter, your brother-in-law was a private man. Few knew the extent of his wealth. He turned back to me. Mr. Hale's estate is considerable. More than considerable. Denise's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. That old man lived like a pauper, she hissed. He didn't even fix the roof. You're telling me he was rich? Michael closed the folder gently. Billionaire might be the right word. The room went silent. The echoes of her disbelief filled the space where my breath should have been. I stared at the casket again at the man I thought I'd known. He'd worn the same jacket for 20 years, saved scraps of wood, counted every penny. I'd never once seen a sign of wealth. Not one. Denise leaned closer, eyes sharp. You must have known, she accused. He told you, didn't he? You must have been after it. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. I didn't. She turned on her heel and stormed out, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. Michael waited until the sound of the door closing faded before speaking again. He also left you something personal, he said, pulling a smaller item from his briefcase, a worn, leather-bound journal. He handed it to me with care. He called this his Ledger of the Heart. He asked that you read it in private. The leather was soft and cool under my fingertips, the edges frayed. I recognized the handwriting immediately, sharp, steady, unmistakably his. I traced the indented initials on the cover, R.H., and felt a pressure rise in my chest. That night back at the farmhouse, I sat at the same table where we'd had our last argument. The journal rested beside the lamp, its shadow stretching across the grain. I hesitated before opening it, afraid of what I might find. The first page was dated the day after my parents' accident. Mark and Elaine died today. The girl remains. I don't know how to be a parent. I only know how to build, not how to raise. The handwriting wavered slightly, as if he'd written in a hurry before the grief could settle. I turned the page. She's small and quiet. I think she looks like Elaine. I don't know what to say to her when she cries, so I tell her to work. It's all I know. I hope one day she understands. My throat tightened. The man who had barked orders, who never once said the word love, had been writing about it all along. Further down the pages, his notes shifted between practical entries and brief confessions. Fixed the south fence today. She helped. Didn't complain once. She's stronger than she knows. Another page read, I fear she'll hate me, but I'd rather she grow hard than helpless. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and kept reading. Each line was another piece of him I'd never met. I wish I could tell her that strength and love can come from the same place. But my father taught me that softness kills. I never learned another way. The last entry came weeks before he died. The ink was lighter, the writing slower. Lauren wants freedom. She's earned it. I hope she takes it and forgives me later. If I'm gone, tell her I was proud. Tell her I love her, even if I never said it. I pressed my hand against the page. The tears came again, quiet this time, heavy with something different than grief. It wasn't just loss anymore. It was understanding. Outside, the wind rattled the porch railing, the same sound that had kept me awake as a child. I looked around the kitchen, the chipped mugs, the ticking clock, the ledger still open on the counter. The house hadn't changed, but I had. For the first time, I saw the love hidden in all the things he'd left behind, the discipline, the work, the order. It had been his language, the only one he knew. The next morning, I met Michael at his office to finalize the papers. His manner was steady, almost gentle. Your grandfather's assets include several holdings, land stocks, and a number of accounts under private trusts, he explained. He wanted everything transferred to you immediately, but he left no conditions, no restrictions. I signed the documents in silence, each stroke of the pen feeling heavier than the last. When it was done, Michael closed the folder. There's one more thing, he said. He asked that you keep the farmhouse if possible, said it was where his heart stayed, even when the world moved on. I looked out the window at the city street below, cars passing, people hurrying, unaware of how easily a life could change in a single morning. I'll keep it, I said. When I returned to the farm later that day, the air was still. I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps echoing softly against the floorboards. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. They felt like memory, tough, quiet, enduring. I stopped at his old chair by the window, the cushion still indented from his shape, and laid the journal there. "Thank you," I said aloud, though no one could hear. "I understand now." Outside the field stretched under the pale winter sun, the earth resting before spring. I stood at the threshold, the wind catching my hair, and for the first time I felt a calm that wasn't emptiness, it was peace. The inheritance, the money, the property, they mattered, but not the way the journal did. That was his true legacy. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew my life was about to begin again this time, carrying both his lessons and his love in equal measure. After I found the journal, something in me began to settle. The grief didn't vanish, but it shifted into something quieter, like a river finally finding its course. I read those pages every night for a week, tracing the ink as though his words might still hold warmth. The more I read, the clearer it became that his silence had never been emptiness. It had been fear. He'd loved me the only way he knew how, through labor structure, and the hope that I'd survive what life would inevitably throw at me. When Michael called to check in about the estate, I told him I wanted to keep the farmhouse. "That's what he would have wanted," I said. He nodded through the phone, his voice steady. "It's yours now. Do with it what feels right." Those words stuck with me. For the first time, what felt right was entirely mine to decide. A few months later, I packed up what little I had and drove 2 hours east to the State University, where I'd been accepted for business school. It wasn't the art program I'd dreamed of, but it felt like the path that honored him while still allowing me to build something new. I moved into a small apartment near campus with peeling wallpaper and a second-hand couch that slanted slightly to one side. It was freedom, but it didn't come easy. The first semester was brutal. Between lectures, late-night study groups, and a part-time job at a coffee shop, I rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. I used to catch myself nodding off during accounting lectures, my pen slipping from my hand. But each time I felt myself slipping, I'd think of his words, "If you start something, you finish it." I'd open the journal and read a line or two before bed. It was like hearing him again, only softer this time, stripped of the sharp edges that once scared me. Money was tight. I kept a small notebook just like his ledger, recording every dollar I spent, rent, groceries, supplies. When friends invited me out, I'd make excuses and stay behind brewing instant coffee instead of going to the cafe down the street. Frugality had become second nature, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he'd taught me. I still remembered his voice when I'd spilled the milk years ago. "That milk is sweat." He was right. Nothing worth having came free. By my second year, the exhaustion began to feel like progress. I'd picked up extra shifts at the coffee shop and worked my way up to assistant manager. My grades held steady. Some nights after closing the shop, I'd walk home under the streetlights, the cold air stinging my cheeks, and think about how far I'd come from that farmhouse kitchen. I didn't miss the strictness, but I missed the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the quiet steadiness of knowing exactly what the next day would bring. Life had become unpredictable, and that uncertainty both thrilled and terrified me. During a rare afternoon off, I visited the art building on campus. The smell of paint and turpentine hit me like a memory. I walked through the gallery rows of student work lining the walls, portraits, landscapes, abstracts. I stood in front of one painting of an old barn under a winter sky, brush strokes rough but full of feeling. It reminded me of home, of him fixing that roof in the snow. I realized then that I didn't have to choose between his way and mine. I could still carry his discipline into the things I loved. After graduation, I used part of the inheritance to start a small logistics company. The idea came naturally, helping local farms transport their produce to city markets. I named it Hale and Avery Logistics, a name that felt both like a tribute and a promise. The early days were hard. Trucks broke down, clients delayed payments, and paperwork piled up faster than I could process it. But I never once thought about quitting. I could almost hear his voice behind me, "If you start something, you finish it." One night after a delivery fell through, I sat in the office surrounded by invoices wondering how I'd make payroll for the next week. The frustration bubbled up until I finally laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from being too tired to cry. I looked around the small room, bare walls, one flickering lamp, stacks of boxes, and whispered, "You'd probably tell me to get up and fix it, wouldn't you?" It felt like he was there, shaking his head, unimpressed, but proud. Things started to turn around after that. Word spread about our reliability, and within a year we were running 3 trucks instead of 1. I hired a handful of local drivers' men who'd lost work when nearby farms closed and made sure they were paid fairly. It felt good to give back to the same kind of people who'd shaped my childhood. One afternoon, Michael stopped by the office unannounced. He looked around, smiling. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud." I didn't answer right away. I was looking out the window, watching one of our trucks pull out of the lot. "I think he already knows," I said finally. That evening, I drove out to the farmhouse for the first time in months. The fields were golden with late summer light, and the wind rustled through the tall grass. The house stood exactly as I'd left it, quiet, sturdy, familiar. I stepped inside and felt the weight of years settle around me. On the table sat his old ledger, still open to the last entry he'd written before he passed. I ran my fingers over the lines, the grooves pressed deep into the paper. I walked to the back porch as the sun began to set. The horizon glowed orange, and the scent of earth filled the air. For a moment, I could almost see him standing there, arms crossed, looking out over the land. I smiled, remembering how I used to think he was unbreakable, carved from the same soil he worked. Now I understood that strength wasn't about hardness. It was about endurance, the kind that keeps showing up even when no one's watching. I took the journal from my bag, the pages soft from being turned so many times, and read the last line again. "I love her, but I don't know how to say it. If I'm gone, tell her I'm proud." The words didn't sting anymore. They warmed. I closed the book, placed it on the railing beside me, and whispered, "You told me after all." The wind picked up, rustling the pages open as if in reply. I watched them flutter until they stilled, resting on a blank page. I smiled. That page felt like an invitation, one I was finally ready to accept. The stars began to show above the fields, faint at first, then brighter as the sky deepened. I stayed there until the last light faded, the night air wrapping around me like an old, familiar coat. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, contracts, deliveries, decisions. But tonight, standing where it all began, I felt something close to peace. And though I didn't know it yet, that peace would be the start of something larger, the moment when my grandfather's lessons stopped feeling like chains and started becoming the wings that carried me forward. The following spring, I went back to the farmhouse for good. The fields were green again, the kind of color that only appears after a long winter, and the air carried that faint sweetness of things just starting to bloom. The house needed work, peeling paint, a few loose shutters, but when I opened the front door, the smell of old wood and soil felt like home. I spent the first few days cleaning, patching walls, and opening windows that hadn't been unlatched in years. Each room carried its own echo, a lesson, a memory, a fragment of the man who had shaped me without ever saying how much he cared. His journal stayed on the kitchen table, the leather worn from my hands turning it over each night. Sometimes I'd read a line or two before bed, just to remind myself of the road we'd both traveled, his in silence, mine through defiance. It no longer hurt to think of him. What used to feel like bitterness had softened into gratitude. I could see finally that he hadn't been trying to take my dreams away. He'd been trying to hand me a set of tools strong enough to build them on my own. When the paperwork for Hale and Avery Logistics came through, I registered the farmhouse as our business address. It felt right that everything I built would start where he had once stood, under the same roof on the same ground. Our first contracts were modest moving produce for nearby farms, hauling lumber from the old mill. But each successful delivery reminded me of the lessons I had learned long before I ever knew what a business plan was. I found myself quoting him to new hires without meaning to phrases about honesty, diligence, and not wasting what others worked for. Most of them didn't know who he was, but I smiled each time I heard his words come out of my mouth. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch after work, the ledger he once kept resting beside me. The ink on those pages had faded, but the discipline behind them was alive in everything I did. I wasn't rich in the way people imagined when they heard the word inheritance. The money helped, of course, but what really mattered was the life I'd learned to build from sweat and purpose. I had come to understand that justice doesn't always mean revenge or apology. Sometimes it's simply growing strong enough to live your life on your own terms, carrying both the love and the pain that made you who you are. One weekend in late summer, Aunt Denise stopped by unexpectedly. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. She stood on the porch uncomfortable, her eyes darting toward the fields. "You've done well for yourself," she said after a moment. Her voice was softer than I remembered. I nodded, unsure how to answer. She handed me an envelope, a photograph of my mother younger than I'd ever seen her, standing beside Raymond with paint on her hands and sunlight in her hair. "Found this in an old box," Denise said quietly. "Figured it should stay here." After she left, I stared at the photo for a long time. My mother was smiling at him in a way that told me their story had been complicated too, maybe built on the same stubborn love that ours had been. I placed the photo on the mantel beside the journal. For the first time, the house didn't feel divided between past and present. It felt whole. Years later, when people asked how I managed to build a company from scratch, I'd tell them it started with a man who believed in working through storms. I didn't mention the money or the inheritance. What I remembered most wasn't the wealth he left behind, but the mornings he woke me before dawn, the nights we fixed fences in the rain, the long silence that had once felt cruel, but was in its own way full of care. Now, when I walk through those same fields, I don't think of him as the hard man who raised me. I think of him as the teacher who taught me that love doesn't always sound kind, but it endures. The sky above the farmhouse is wide and quiet, and sometimes when the wind moves through the trees, I can almost hear his voice again, steady, firm, certain, as if reminding me that strength and tenderness can live side by side. That's the legacy he left me, the one no one could see on paper. It wasn't about fortune. It was about integrity, perseverance, and the quiet kind of love that outlasts pride. I keep learning from it every day, and when the world feels too heavy, I open his journal and read that last line one more time. I love her, even if I never said it. If you've ever carried someone's lessons long after they're gone, I hope this story reminds you that silence can still hold love, and that sometimes understanding comes long after goodbye. And if it touched you in any way, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it too.